In 1905, deep inside a quiet office in Berlin, an aging German general named Alfred von Schlieffen sat hunched over maps and calculations, obsessively working on what he believed would be his masterpiece, a military strategy so audacious, so ruthlessly efficient, that it would solve Germany's greatest strategic nightmare and secure the nation's survival for generations to come. But instead it would become the spark that ignited the most catastrophic conflict humanity had ever witnessed, killing over 17 million people, toppling 4 ancient empires, redrawing the map of Europe, and fundamentally changing the nature of human warfare forever. Schlieffen wasn't some warmongering madman. He was a brilliant strategist who clearly saw Germany's impossible geographic predicament, trapped in the heart of Europe between two massive powers, France to the west, burning for revenge after their humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and Russia to the east, with the largest army on the planet, slowly modernizing and growing stronger every year. The nightmare that kept Schlieffen awake at night was the inevitability of a two-front war, because if Germany ever had to fight both France and Russia simultaneously, the nation would be crushed between these two giants like a walnut in a vise, stretched too thin, unable to concentrate forces, bleeding resources until collapse became inevitable. So Schlieffen devoted years of his life to solving this puzzle, running countless war games, studying every historical campaign from Hannibal to Napoleon, analyzing railroad timetables, calculating march speeds, measuring distances down to the kilometer, and slowly, methodically, he constructed what he believed was the perfect solution, a plan so precise it read more like a train schedule than a military operation. The core concept was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The moment war was declared, Germany would ignore France's heavily fortified eastern border, where the French expected an attack, and instead send the vast majority of the German army, 7/8 of its entire military force, sweeping through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg in a massive wheeling movement that would curve down through northern France like a giant scythe, envelop Paris from the west, trap the French armies against their own fortifications, and force a complete surrender within exactly 42 days. Once France was eliminated, the entire German army would then use Germany's superior railroad network to rapidly redeploy eastward and smash into the Russian forces, who Schlieffen calculated would take at least 6 weeks to fully mobilize their enormous but lumbering army due to Russia's primitive infrastructure and vast distances. The plan required split-second timing, absolute commitment, and the willingness to violate Belgian neutrality, which had been guaranteed by treaty since 1839, but Schlieffen famously dismissed these concerns with cold pragmatism, allegedly uttering on his deathbed in 1913,
"Keep the right wing strong," referring to the crucial northern attacking force that would sweep through Belgium. For nearly a decade after Schlieffen's retirement in 1906, this plan sat in German military archives like a cold spring under pressure. And a whole generation of German officers studied it, refined it, built their entire military doctrine around it, constructing new railways to facilitate troop movements, positioning ammunition depots, planning supply routes, until the Schlieffen Plan wasn't just a strategy anymore, it was Germany's only strategy, the singular answer to every potential conflict scenario. Then came June 28, 1914, a sunny Sunday morning in Sarajevo, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie were riding in an open car through the city streets, and a teenage Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, armed with a pistol and fueled by dreams of South Slavic independence from Austro-Hungarian rule, stepped forward and fired 2 shots that would echo around the world. The first bullet pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck, the second hit Sophie in the abdomen, and within minutes both were dead, setting in motion a diplomatic crisis that would spiral out of control with terrifying speed. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany's infamous blank check of unconditional support, issued an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh it was designed to be rejected. And when Serbia's response was deemed insufficient, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914, expecting a quick localized conflict to punish Serbian nationalism. But the alliance system that had been built up over decades now activated like a chain of explosives. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, began mobilizing its massive army to defend Serbia. Watching Russian mobilization with alarm, and remembering that the Schlieffen Plan required striking before Russia could fully deploy its forces, declared war on Russia on August 1st, then declared war on France on August 3rd under the flimsiest of pretexts. And Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgian neutrality and watching Germany's intentions with growing horror, issued an ultimatum that was ignored, leading to a British declaration of war on August 4th. In those first chaotic days of August 1914, as diplomats scrambled and populations cheered in the streets, expecting a glorious adventure that would be over by Christmas, the German military machine activated the Schlieffen Plan with mechanical precision. Over 1.5 million German soldiers, organized into massive armies, began moving toward Belgium's border, and on August 4th, German forces crossed into Belgium and demanded free passage, a request that the Belgian King Albert I refused with unexpected defiance, declaring that Belgium would resist the violation of its neutrality even against impossible odds. What followed shocked the world. The German army, needing to maintain its strict timetable, smashed through Belgian defenses with overwhelming force. And when Belgian civilians engaged in guerrilla resistance, or were even suspected of it, German commanders responded with calculated brutality, burning entire towns like Leuven with its ancient library containing irreplaceable medieval manuscripts, executing civilians in mass reprisals, and creating a wave of refugees that flooded into France and Britain, generating newspaper headlines about German atrocities, the rape of Belgium, that turned global public opinion decisively against Germany, and would later help bring the United States into the war. The German advance was staggering in its scale and speed. Millions of soldiers in field-gray uniforms, marching in seemingly endless columns, horse-drawn artillery batteries stretching for miles, supply wagons and ammunition trains following behind, all moving with such coordination that French generals initially couldn't believe the reports, couldn't comprehend that Germany had committed so much of its army to this single, massive wheeling movement through Belgium. The fortress city of Liège, which Belgian planners had believed could hold out for months, fell in just days to specialized German siege artillery, including the monstrous 42-centimeter Big Bertha howitzers that fired shells weighing nearly a ton and could demolish the most modern concrete fortifications. And Brussels, the Belgian capital, fell on August 20th, as the Belgian army retreated westward, and German forces continued their inexorable push into France. French commanders, who had developed their own war plan called Plan 17, based on the doctrine of offensive spirit and direct attacks into German-held Alsace-Lorraine, suddenly found themselves reacting to a German invasion from an unexpected direction. And as French armies attempted to redeploy northward, they suffered catastrophic casualties in a series of frontier battles that saw French soldiers in their distinctive blue coats and red trousers, uniforms that made them perfect targets, charging German machine gun positions with bayonets and being mowed down by the thousands. By late August, the situation looked desperate for France and Britain. The small British expeditionary force that had crossed the Channel to help defend France fought a brave delaying action at Mons, but was forced to retreat. French armies were falling back toward Paris in confusion, and the German right wing was sweeping forward, exactly as Schlieffen had envisioned, covering up to 25 miles per day in forced marches that left soldiers exhausted but still advancing. In Paris, the French government prepared to evacuate to Bordeaux. Civilians fled southward in panic, and the military governor of Paris began preparing the city's defenses for a siege, while across the English Channel, British newspapers ran increasingly alarmed headlines about the possibility of France collapsing entirely within weeks. But this is where the Schlieffen Plan, which had worked so brilliantly on paper and had functioned remarkably well for the first month of war, began to unravel due to a combination of factors that its creator had never adequately accounted for. First, Schlieffen's successor as chief of the German General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, nephew of the famous Moltke, who had won the wars of German unification, had made critical modifications to the plan before the war started, weakening the right wing that was supposed to sweep through Belgium by diverting forces to defend Alsace-Lorraine and East Prussia, fundamentally undermining the mathematical precision that made the plan work. Second, the German soldiers advancing through Belgium and France were beyond exhausted after weeks of continuous marching in summer heat, carrying heavy equipment, fighting rearguard actions, and trying to maintain a pace that their supply lines couldn't keep up with. Horses were dying by the thousands, soldiers were falling asleep while marching, boots were falling apart, and the army was literally outrunning its supply trains and communication networks. Third, the Belgian resistance, though ultimately futile in stopping the German advance, had delayed the timetable by several precious days, and those days mattered because the Schlieffen Plan was built on a rigid schedule where every day counted. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, the Russian army had mobilized faster than German planners had anticipated. And when Russian forces invaded East Prussia in mid-August, Moltke panicked and diverted two entire corps, over 100,000 men, from the Western Front to defend Germany's eastern border, further weakening the crucial right wing just as it approached its moment of decision. By early September 1914, as German armies closed in on Paris from the northeast, separated by gaps that were growing wider due to exhaustion and diverging routes of advance, French and British commanders saw an opportunity. The German First Army under Alexander von Kluck, which was supposed to curve west around Paris, had instead turned southeast to pursue retreating French forces, exposing its right flank to a counterattack from the Paris garrison. The French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, a methodical man who had remained remarkably calm throughout the crisis, organized every available force he could find, including rushing 6,000 reserve troops to the front in a fleet of 600 Parisian taxicabs in one of history's most famous improvisations, and on September 6th launched a massive counterattack along the Marne River that caught the Germans by surprise. The Battle of the Marne raged for 4 days across a front of over 200 miles, involving nearly 2 million men, and ended with the Germans recognizing that their advance had stalled, their flanks were vulnerable, and the grand plan had failed. On September 9th, Moltke ordered a general retreat to defensive positions along the Aisne River, and though German forces remained deep inside France, the dream of a quick knockout victory had died. Both sides then attempted to outflank each other to the north, in what became known as the Race to the Sea, each side extending their lines westward until they reached the English Channel, and by November 1914, an unbroken line of trenches stretched from Switzerland to the sea, over 400 miles of zigzagging fortifications that would barely move for the next 4 years, despite millions of casualties and countless offensives. What Schlieffen had imagined as a war of rapid movement and decisive victory had transformed into a nightmarish war of attrition that nobody had planned for and nobody knew how to win. Soldiers on both sides dug themselves into elaborate trench systems that became underground cities, complete with command posts, aid stations, supply depots, and living quarters, all connected by communication trenches and protected by increasingly sophisticated networks of barbed wire, machine gun positions, and artillery. The technology of defense, machine guns that could fire 600 rounds per minute, quick-firing artillery, barbed wire, and concrete fortifications had completely outpaced the technology of offense, meaning that any attack faced nearly insurmountable obstacles. And yet generals on both sides, still clinging to doctrines of offensive warfare and lacking any other ideas, ordered assault after assault that sent millions of men climbing out of their trenches to advance across open ground swept by machine gun fire and artillery, leading to casualty rates that defied comprehension. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, the bloodiest single day in British military history. And by the time the offensive ended months later, over 1 million men from both sides were dead, wounded, or missing for territorial gains that could be measured in mere miles. At Verdun, also in 1916, French and German forces engaged in a 10-month battle of mutual destruction that killed or wounded over 700,000 men in fighting over a relatively small salient that had more symbolic than strategic value, with individual positions changing hands dozens of times, and the landscape transformed into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters where nothing could survive. The weapons became more horrific as the war progressed. Poison gas was first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, with chlorine gas clouds rolling across no man's land and causing men to drown in their own fluids, leading to an escalating chemical arms race involving phosgene and mustard gas that left hundreds of thousands dead or permanently disabled. Flamethrowers that could shoot jets of burning liquid into trenches and bunkers. Tanks that first appeared in 1916 as a potential solution to trench warfare, but remained too primitive and unreliable to achieve decisive results. And aircraft that evolved from reconnaissance tools to fighters and bombers engaged in deadly aerial combat and attacks on civilian targets. The home fronts were mobilized to an unprecedented degree, with entire economies transformed to serve the war effort. Factories that had made consumer goods now produced shells and rifles by the millions. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had gone to fight. Governments imposed rationing and censorship and propaganda campaigns, and the distinction between soldier and civilian blurred as both became targets and participants in what became history's first total war. The global dimensions of the conflict expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined in 1914. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Austria-Hungary, opening new fronts in the Middle East and leading to catastrophic campaigns like Gallipoli, where Allied forces suffered over 250,000 casualties in a failed attempt to knock the Ottomans out of the war. Japan seized German possessions in China and the Pacific. Fighting spread to Africa as colonial powers battled over German colonies. Italy joined the Allies in 1915 and engaged in brutal mountain warfare against Austria-Hungary that produced its own horrific casualty lists. And eventually, the United States, provoked by unrestricted German submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, entered the war in April 1917, tipping the balance of resources decisively toward the Allies. Russia, meanwhile, descended into revolution after years of military disasters and economic collapse killed millions, and destroyed faith in the Tsarist government, leading to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Russia's withdrawal from the war and the establishment of the Soviet Union that would shape global politics for the rest of the century. By the time the fighting finally ended on November 11, 1918, after Germany's spring 1918 offensives failed and Allied counteroffensives broke German resistance, the world had been fundamentally transformed. Over 17 million people were dead. Another 20 million were wounded. Four great empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, had collapsed. The map of Europe and the Middle East had been completely redrawn. Colonial subjects in Africa and Asia had seen their European masters' claims of superiority shattered by European barbarism. New technologies of destruction had been perfected, and the psychological trauma of industrial slaughter would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations payments, loss of territory, strict limits on military forces, and a war guilt clause that blamed Germany exclusively for the conflict, creating resentments that would fester for decades and provide fertile ground for Adolf Hitler's rise to power and the outbreak of an even more catastrophic Second World War, just 21 years later. The Schlieffen Plan, conceived as a brilliant solution to Germany's strategic problems, had instead created a cascade of consequences that killed a generation, destroyed the old European order, unleashed ideologies of communism and fascism that would dominate the 20th century, established patterns of mechanized warfare that would culminate in the horrors of World War II, and demonstrated with terrible clarity that modern war had become so destructive, so all-consuming, that even victory would be Pyrrhic and defeat would be catastrophic. Looking back over a century later, historians still debate whether the Schlieffen Plan could ever have worked, whether Moltke's modifications doomed it from the start, whether Belgian resistance and Russian speed disrupted its timetable fatally, whether its fundamental assumptions about the possibility of swift, decisive victory in modern war were always fantasy. But what remains undebatable is that this single military plan, activated in August 1914 and collapsing in September 1914, set in motion events that would reshape human civilization, kill tens of millions directly and indirectly, and cast a shadow so long that we still live in the world it created, a world of nation-states born from empire's ruins, of international institutions designed to prevent such catastrophes. Whether its fundamental assumptions about the possibility of swift, decisive victory in modern war were always fantasy. But what remains undebatable is that this single military plan, activated in August 1914 and collapsing in September 1914, set in motion events that would reshape human civilization, kill tens of millions directly and indirectly, and cast a shadow so long that we still live in the world it created, a world of nation-states born from empire's ruins, of international institutions designed to prevent such catastrophes.